วันนี้ประเด็นเรื่องคนโรฮิงญาเป็นอีกครั้งที่ขยายความเข้าสู่เวทีระดับโลกนะคะเมื่อประธานาธิบดีสหรัฐบารักโอบามาถูกถามคำถามนี้โดยตรงๆนะคะโดยบรรดาตัวแทนของ75คนในอาเซียนที่เข้าร่วมโครงการผู้นำรุ่นใหม่แห่งอาเซียนนะคะเป็นช่วงหนึ่งของการถามคำถามที่ทำเนียบขาวค่ะ
Thank you. Thank you. Everybody, please have a seat. Well, thank you so much, Zimar, for your
โดยตัวแทนผู้นำในอาเซียน75คนไปเยือนทำเนียบขาวโดยเป็นตัวแทนของ10ประเทศอาเซียนเป็นบรรดาผู้นำที่มาจากสาขาอาชีพ55คนอีก20คนเป็นตัวแทนนักวิชาการเป็นเวทีที่บรรดาตัวแทนในอาเซียนได้โอกาสซักถามประธานาธิบดีสหรัฐอย่างตรงไปตรงมาหัวข้อก็หลากหลายนะคะเพื่อเพิ่มทักษะความเป็นผู้นำและทำงานร่วมกับสหรัฐต่อไปและส่งเสริมโอกาสทางเศรษฐกิจธรรมาภิบาลการจัดการทรัพยากรธรรมชาติและสิ่งแวดล้อมและการมีส่วนร่วมของภาคประชาชนประธานาธิบดีโอบามามีโอกาสได้ตอบหลายประเด็นไม่ว่าจะเป็นมุมมองส่วนตัวในการใช้ชีวิตและนโยบายของสหรัฐเรื่องหุ้นส่วนเศรษฐกิจทั่วแปซิฟิกแต่มีอยู่เรื่องหนึ่งที่ประธานาธิบดีสหรัฐถูกถามตรงๆเกี่ยวกับคนโรฮิงญาเลี่ยงไม่ตอบก็ไม่ได้นะคะประธานาธิบดีโอบามาหยุดไปชั่วอึดใจก่อนที่จะตอบคำถามนี้ซึ่งถามโดยตัวแทนคนไทยค่ะ
สวัสดีค่ะ Good afternoon, Mr. President. My name is Pensili Bansili. I'm from Thailand, and now I work on the anti-human trafficking issue in Thailand and neighboring country. So today I would like to ask you that if you were a Rohingya, which country would you prefer to live with, and why? Thank you so much.
That's an interesting question. Let me speak more broadly, and then I'll answer your question. We were talking earlier about what's required for Myanmar to succeed. I think one of the most important things is to put an end to discrimination against people because of what they look like or what their faith is. And the Rohingya have been discriminated against significantly. And that's part of the reason they're fleeing. I think if I were Rohingya, I would want to stay where I was born. I'd want to stay in the land where my parents had lived. But I'd want to make sure that my government was protecting me and that people were treating me fairly. That's what I'd want. And that's why it's so important, I think, as part of the democratic transition to take very seriously this issue of how the Rohingya are treated. One of the things about discriminating against people or treating people differently is, by definition, that means that people will treat you differently. And you never know when you will find yourself in a situation in which you are a minority, where you are vulnerable, where you're not being treated fairly. And right now, obviously, our focus is on making sure that those who are being subject to human trafficking and are, in some cases right now, still in a very perilous situation out in the open sea, that though they are relocated. I want to commend Indonesia and Malaysia for their willingness to take on thousands of these displaced persons. The United States, as part of our refugee process, will take some. We've put over $100 million into, over the last several years in Burma, to make sure that minority groups, including the Rohingya, are protected against. But ultimately, this is going to be a great test for the democracy of the future, not just in Burma and Myanmar, but in areas all throughout the country. When I was, and I know this directly, because when I was young, and I was living in Indonesia, there were times where there were anti-Chinese riots that were very violent and vicious. And in fact, sometimes the Chinese Indonesians were treated very similarly to how Jewish Europeans were treated in Europe, and subject to stereotypes and resentments. And the truth of the matter is, one of the reasons that Singapore, I mentioned earlier, has been successful is that it has been able to bring together people who may look different, but they all think of themselves as part of Singapore. And that has to be a strength, not a weakness. But that requires leadership and government being true to those principles. To their credit, the Indonesian government, when I was growing up, was very good about not discriminating on the basis of religion, despite the fact that it was 98% Muslim. And I think that the tolerance towards other faiths historically in Indonesia has been part of what's contributed to progress there. You haven't seen the same kind of sectarian animosity that you've seen in parts of the Middle East. But you know, the one thing I know is countries that divide themselves on racial or religious lines, they do not succeed. They do not succeed. That's rule number one. Rule number two is nations that suppress their women do not succeed. They don't succeed. Because not only is it bad because half the country is not successful, because they're not getting education and opportunity, but it's women who teach children, which means the children are less educated if you're not teaching the moms. So there's some, each country is different, but there's some rules, if you look at development patterns around the world, that are pretty consistent, and those are two pretty good rules. Don't divide yourself on religious and ethnic lines and racial lines, and don't discriminate against women. If you do those two things, you know, you're not guaranteed success, but at least you're not guaranteed failure.